This is my open genre literacy project, which is a review of the Grand Budapest Hotel with going over the general plot summary, as there is not a lot of spoilers to the movie. It's fairly straightforward, as well as going over the different acting performances of the actors and focusing on a few specific performances that were very well done, going over different character influences as well as just general character thoughts, and then the different directing choices, as this is a very stylistic movie. Wes Anderson is the director, is very known for having a very specific directing style, as well as other choices. And to start off, this movie is very ridiculous, to say the least. A lot of the stuff is, it works well. It works very well in the movie because it does not take itself too seriously, and it understands how ridiculous some of these choices are. Like, starting with the general plot, to give you a sense of how ridiculous, the movie opens with a woman stopping by the grave of an author and then starts reading the book, to which the movie then cuts to an interview with the author when he's older, talking about how he came across the story, and then it cuts to the author being younger in a book-style narration of him at the Grand Budapest Hotel when it's older than the main story, and meeting the owner of the hotel at that time, who then over dinner tells the younger version of the author the story of how he came to own the hotel. So as you can see, where it's the woman into the interview, into the story with the owner, into the main story, which takes a place around in the 1930s, you can see how the ridiculousness could even be felt from that beginning, because it is unnecessarily complicated in the best way possible. So, for the general plot, we go through, the woman reads the book, and then we go to an interview with the author, who then starts talking about him finding the story, and then it cuts to a completely book-style narration as it talks about everything, like how he came to be at the hotel in its off-season, and how it was originally very lavish and is now a bit more run down. And at the hotel, talking with the concierge, he meets the owner of the hotel, Mr. Mustafa, and he asks him if he would be willing to tell him the story of how he came to own the hotel, came to buy it and own it, to which the hotel owner agrees and says that he never bought the hotel. And then it cuts to the main story, where we are now focused on Monsieur Gustave, who is played by Ralph Fiennes in the movie. And this is when we get to the main general plot, and Monsieur Gustave is prepping a room to meet an older woman, and as we find later in the movie, he is the concierge at the Grand Budapest at what would be described as its height of lavishness and height of being a fantastic, like a grand hotel. And afterwards, after the older Mr. Gustav sends the older woman off as she was leaving the hotel for the time, and the woman was fearing that she was going to die soon, and Monsieur Gustav just writes out. He meets Zero, who is the younger version of Mr. Mustafa, who is hired as the new lobby boy pending Monsieur Gustav's approval. So then we go through Zero's hired, and we go through a montage of what he does at the hotel, which is being instructed by Monsieur Gustav over top of the montage. And we learn, like, Monsieur Gustav is what really brings people to the hotel. It's what really, like, what people come back for. And it is then we do not know who the owner of the hotel is, but we do know that Monsieur Gustav and the floor manager of the hotel meet with the owner's emissary, Deputy Kovacs, who is played by Jeff Goldblum, who has a bit of a minor role but still does very well. And this is just to establish that the owner is unknown. And then one day, a month after meeting the old woman who's known as Madame D, and I will refer to her as Madame D, as her full title is extraordinarily long for comedic reasons, obviously. Zero sees in a newspaper that she died, and while that was not the headline of it is that war is starting, and this is fairly obvious to be a allusion to World War II in general, even though it is not outright said, and I'll get into that a bit more with the directing choices for the movie. And so Monsieur Gustav and Zero both travel together by train/car to Lutz, where to go to the funeral of Madame D, as Madame D and Monsieur Gustav were very close. And it is then they are stopped by the German soldiers, as it is established Zero is an immigrant and came from a country, and it is further established that of the illusion of these soldiers being German Nazis of the time. And we meet another fairly big actor with a very small role, Edward Norton, playing Henkels, who is a soldier at the time, and more or less establishing the German soldiers as a kind of secondary antagonist. But Gustav and Zero go to Madame D's funeral, and Deputy Kovacs is the executor of Madame D's estate, and he reads that a change was made to the will fairly recently, that Monsieur Gustav is left with a priceless painting called Boy with Apple. And for the movie, it is essentially the same thing as the Mona Lisa. It is the Mona Lisa of the movie. And that's when we meet Dimitri, played by Adrian Brody, who is the main antagonist, as well as we meet his accomplice Jopling, played by Willem Dafoe, who does a fantastic job in a very menacing role. Adrian Brody does a fantastic job as well, but I'll get into more of that with the acting performances. And a lot of stuff happens. Gustav and Zero steal Boy with Apple. I know I've been using a lot of air quotes, but they steal it. He's been willed it, but they take it without anyone knowing. Well, aside from one house servant and the butler, Serge. And Serge puts something, when they're wrapping Boy with Apple up to take it, Serge puts a document hidden in the wrapping on the back of the painting, and Gustav and Zero leave. But once they get back to the hotel and hide Boy with Apple in the safe and everything, the German police come to arrest Gustav, as it is believed that he murdered Madame D and stole Boy with Apple. Well, actually, at the time, they did not know that he had stolen Boy with Apple yet. So Gustav goes to prison, and we learn that Serge was the one who told the police that he saw Monsieur Gustave come to the residence of Madame D at the time, which we know as a viewer did not happen. And it is at that time we know that Serge was pressured by the rest of Madame D's family into saying that it was Gustave who murdered Madame D. But Serge essentially disappears, which causes problems, and we then go to Jopling, again played by Willem Dafoe, checking in with Serge's sister as looking for him, establishing a threat there as the hotel continues to run, but then we cut back to Gustave, who has made friends with prisoners and whatnot, and they plan to escape prison, but they need tools. But at this point, we cut back to the young author and an older Zero Mustafa talking, and Mr. Mustafa is very distressed at this time and is crying because he must, to continue the story, he must talk about Agatha, which we then learn was his love interest at the time, and I guess spoilers a little bit, that him and Agatha end up getting married at the end of the movie, even though they're young, but it's supposed to be funny and romantic and whatnot. We're not privy to either of their ages. Based off of how they look, it is right to assume probably about 16, 17. But Mr. Mustafa continues the story and talks about Zero and Agatha meeting and whatnot, and almost instantly falling in love and everything, and how at that time, to help Monsieur Gustave escape, they hide tools to escape in these chocolates, as Agatha works at a pastry place called Mendel's that creates these really decadent looking pastries and chocolates and whatnot. So they hide tools in that, and because at the prison, while most of the food would be like poked and prodded to make sure nothing's in it, the person doing that sees the work of the chocolates hiding the tools and does not do anything, as it looks too good and everything. So Gustave escapes with his group of convicts, and then Gustave and Zero are on the run from the police, since Gustave didn't escape and whatnot. And Joplin, I did miss something before that happened. Well, two things. One, Deputy Kovacs talks with Dmitri and Joplin and Dmitri's sisters on how there is a document that is missing from the large amount of amendments to the will, and how given the disappearance of Serge as well as the implications of murder that Gustav committed, it is best to not move forward, to which Dmitri disagrees and then has Joplin later kill Deputy Kovacs to potentially just get the fortune into his hands and everything. And as well, Zero tells Agatha about the whole situation with Boy with Apple and gives her directions to be able to find it in the hotel, which will come into play later. And now back with Gustav and Zero, they find out where Serge is hiding through a society of concierges of different grand hotels, and like the general information that they all have and everything. So they are taking a train to go there, while Joplin kills Serge's sister and finds a telegram that Serge sent, and now knows where he is as well. So they go up to the mountains, and Gustav and Zero meet up with Serge and Serge mentions of a copy of the second will that was created by Madame D in the case of her death by murder. But before he can say where it is, Joplin kills him. So we have, and starts running away, and Zero and Mr. Gustav chase after Joplin, and Zero ends up killing him in what is a fairly comedic way, where it was a long chase down like this ski resort area and stuff, and Zero and Monsieur Gustav were on a sled, and Joplin was on skis, and Joplin stops before the end, but Zero and Monsieur Gustav crash. Monsieur Gustav goes flying and is hanging off the edge of a cliff, and you see Zero is upside down in the snow, and there is a bit of a monologue from Monsieur Gustav to Joplin, as Joplin is like stomping on the snow to get him, but Zero comes up behind him and like shoulder tackles him like off the cliff in a very funny manner, as Monsieur Gustav reacts in a very funny way. So then they steal Joplin's motorcycle and head back to the hotel to meet up with Agatha so that they could get the painting and just generally escape. But Dmitri shows up to the hotel as well, as he is part of like the regime of the new German soldiers, as the hotel is also being turned into a pseudo barracks / housing place for high-ranking military personnel, and which causes a chase as he sees Agatha with the painting, and he knows what Agatha looks like through a piece of dialogue earlier in the movie. It would be more specific watching it. So it starts a comedic chase, as it is fairly slow as to not draw attention to each other, but then leads to a shootout as Monsieur Gustav and Zero are inside the hotel as well and meet across a hallway with Dmitri, and Dmitri starts to shoot at them, to which they hide in an elevator, but a lot of German officials hear the shooting and come out of their bedrooms and just start shooting across the ways, as it's like two separate balconies, and then there's one over here with stairs leading up on this side, and everyone is just shooting back and forth at each other, with Hankel's, Edward Norton's character, showing up and being like, all right, everyone stop, everyone's under arrest, just stop. But we hear Agatha as she somehow fell out a window and Zero chases to find her, to which he falls out a window hanging from the same area that Agatha is, and they end up falling into a truck full of boxes, and they find the copy of the second will that Serge put on the back of the painting, and it is now told that in case of murder, Madame D left everything to Monsieur Gustave as well, which also includes the hotel, as Madame D was the secret owner of the hotel. And then Monsieur Gustave makes Zero the concierge, and Agatha and Zero get married, and older Zero, Mr. Mustafa, tells of that a few years after that, Agatha and their newborn son are killed by a made-up disease that would most likely be attributed to something such as the flu or chicken pox or something of that sort. But before that, we learned that Monsieur Gustave was killed in a similar train scene to before when we first met Hankels, in a very similar scene. And we learn that the German soldiers end up shooting Monsieur Gustave. And the movie ultimately ends going back through the different levels and seeing the general reflections of the people either telling the story or reading the story, and their general reflections on what was said. That nothing is said, but like facial expressions giving the general reactions to the story. So now on to acting performances. Monsieur Gustave is played by Ralph Fiennes. Monsieur Gustave is a very old-fashioned man with a lot of grace around him, reminiscent of a decadent times, much more similar to something that would have been like in the upper class of the 1860s to early 1900s. Like, he talks a lot of poetry. He's a very perfumed man. He talks of a lot of civilization and whatnot. And Ralph Fiennes gives a fantastic performance. Absolutely fantastic. And then you also have the other main character, the younger version of Zero, played by Tony Revolori, who at the time, this movie was his big break, as he did not star in much of anything else. And he is now known as Flash Thompson in the MCU's Spider-Man trilogy. And he does a fantastic job, as well as kind of being a younger version of Monsieur Gustave, with obviously a different life experiences, as in the movie we find out that due to the war and its continuation and whatnot, Zero was forced out of his country as a refugee to the war, and we learn that his family has essentially all been killed and whatnot. And then we also have Saoirse Ronan as Agatha. She's a bit more of a minor character, but she is a bigger part to the story, and she does a very good job. Dimitri, played by Adrian Brody, fantastic acting job, does a very good job of being a more comedic antagonist, as like the threat is there, but anytime he's on screen, it's generally a much more lighthearted, funny time than anything more serious that would potentially be seen with Joplin, played by Willem Dafoe, who also does a great job. And just in general, Ralph Fiennes and Tony Revolori just kind of steal the show in any scenes that they're in, and whenever they're together, they have a tremendous amount of chemistry. And then when it comes to directing choices, a lot of the narration is spoken in book terms, as like, it's not like, at times it's like he asked and then the quote, and then like she said the quote and whatnot, but like especially when it's the younger author talking with older Mr. Mustafa, at the beginning part of that section, there is a huge amount of book reminiscent narration going on. And then as when it comes to the cinematography, it is very interesting. It is very in line with other Wes Anderson movies, where it is always a direct on like 90-degree angle shot, where it's either like 90 degrees this way, or directly on. There's no over the shoulder shots or anything like that, and the camera will just move. In the movie, it would rather move with the characters than cut, and it never really cuts between two characters' faces. It does, but it'll cut from like back. It'll be like facing this character to facing this character in different ways, and no matter what, the main focus of the character, who is most likely talking, if it's like a single character, will be in the direct center of the shot, creating a large amount of symmetry and whatnot. And then another thing with the directing choices is that there is a large amount of big names in this movie that play relatively small roles. Jeff Goldblum as Deputy Kovacs, as he is one of the more important side characters. He's not the most important. You have Bill Murray and Owen Wilson in extremely small roles. Like, they are almost extras with the limited amount of dialogue that they have. Jude Law plays the younger version of the author, which is another very big name, and while he obviously does more, he's not as important and could have easily been played by someone a lot less known. And then Edward Norton being a secondary antagonist, kind of, but not exactly. It's all these, and it's just Wes Anderson being such a famous director that he draws in these names. And then as well, like I said before, there's a huge, this movie is very comedic. There's a lot of quick dialogue that is executed very well, that really pulls it all together. And then as well as with some of the ridiculousness, I already talked about the narration, where it's the book into an interview, into the author learning the story that is being told from the interview, to the actual story itself, as it's very layered like that for no reason aside from being very comedic, to the character Agatha having a birthmark across her cheek that is literally a large shape of Mexico, for no exact reason aside from it's a birthmark in the shape of Mexico. But the movie, I like what Wes Anderson did with being in a contentious time frame with early 1930s in what would mostly be Eastern Europe, but he never makes it completely direct, as it's always a fake country, something that's fake, that is extremely hard to narrow down where this is supposed to be, as the soldiers obviously take a lot of inspiration from World War II Germany and whatnot, but you have characters like Gustav, who Ralph Fiennes has a very thick British accent in it. You have Agatha, who is a bit more of an Irish-Scottish accent. Zero, who is more American. So it's extremely hard to truly narrow down where this is supposed to be, as well as like the currency is in Clubex, which, if that's an actual currency, I have no knowledge to that at all, and it's taken place in a town called, part of it is taking place in a town called Nevillesbad and Zabrovka, and it's meant to allude to World War II, but it's meant to also be like unknown to the readers, to the watcher, where it's supposed to actually be. And then as well, with most scenes, it's always in kind of like a color gradient where there's only really like 4 or 5, maybe 6 different colors in each scene. It's always very, and that's the thing with Wes Anderson. He always has like a certain color distinction for everything. And like, Wes Anderson is a very stylized director, and this is really on show in this movie, as he takes all of his ideas running and just like goes nuts with them, where it's like the set design, like anything that would be like a square room, but like none of the people are moving. The sets are just like cut in half, where it's like a half cube, and the camera is like moving along with it if the set is moving or whatnot, to keep that like direct on shots and whatnot. And it's just things like that are really enhance the movie. And while like it has some crass humor and it has like a bit of violence, it's never over the top. Like like a couple nosebleeds happen from getting like hit in the face, but like the streams of blood are like they're drawn on with pencils to try and keep, even though the movies are rated, to try and keep it more appropriate for a lot of other people. So if like someone is not does not do well with like blood or gore, they can still really enjoy this movie, as it's not meant to be bloody or gory. It's meant to be really comedic and just a really fun movie. To wrap up, out of 10, I would most likely rate this as a 9.5, if not a 10. This is a fantastic movie. I would highly recommend watching it if you have not seen it. It is one of my personal favorites of all time. It is fantastic. In my opinion, it is Wes Anderson's best movie, and unless he makes something on the level of Shawshank Redemption, it will forever be his best movie. It is fantastic in essentially every way imaginable. I would highly recommend it. Thank you for listening.